Psychologists of Reddit, have you ever been genuinely scared by a patient before? What's your story? Saw a new client for our first session at my home practice. We seemed to click and work together fine. He said he wanted to work through some trauma had experienced when he was physically attacked by a previous psychologist. Hearing about terrible psychologists always riles me up, so I was immediately on his side. When I talked with my supervisor about the case a week later, she asked me his full name, which never happens, so I was weirded out immediately. She googled the name then and there and wordlessly handed me her iPad. It was full of news articles about this client and his attacks on psychologists in my local area. I obviously did not see him again, but I was nervous for ages because he knew where I lived. A very sweet, mostly blind teenager who was going through his first psychotic break and had a love of martial arts, Taekwondo. If I remember correctly, was really good at it. He couldn't see and would practice kicks. And at one point, accidentally kicked one of the reinforced shatterproof windows in the quiet room. Think padded room without the padding. Turns out they were shatter resistant. He destroyed it with that kick. Why those particular details? Because he would practice his kicks everywhere. Was mostly blind. And the one time he flipped up to practice one and I was walking around the corner. It came literal centimeters from my face. And I felt the impact of it against the air. Like a physical force bashing into my face. Sweetest kid in the world. He would have been horrified if it had connected. Because things would have broken. A lot of things. He also grabbed my arm once in a suddenly firm grasp and asked if I wanted to do Taekwondo with him. No, I did not. I'm a therapist. But not a psychologist, if that matters. I used to work in a facility for kids and adolescents with pretty intense behavioral issues. Even when a client was aggressive, I was usually able to de-escalate them and I generally didn't feel unsafe. In fact, most of the time I was concerned about their safety during outbursts. With one exception. I had a client that was pretty strong and prone to intense tantruming. This client was acting in a way that was unsafe, had a plan to seriously hurt another resident, I think. So I had to put them on restriction, within staff eyesight at all times. Their response was to run up to me and attempt to choke me. Luckily the staff got there in time and prevented this kid from seriously hurting me. On another occasion, this same client also took apart their curtain rod in their bedroom and swung it at my head. I dodged in time. Oddly enough, this client and I had a pretty good relationship the other 99% of the time, and I generally enjoyed working with them. Once when I was a medical student, I was asked to see a patient in the psychiatric unit of the emergency room. I walked in with my short white coat and clipboard and asked the guy what brought him in today and what was wrong. He looked me dead in the eyes with foamy saliva dribbling from the corner of his mouth and a strange smell in the air and said, "The devil told me to kill you and kill myself." He was sweaty and his eyes were bloodshot and his wife beater had dark red/brown stains on it. The door was behind him and I wasn't sure I could make it there before something bad happened. No idea if he had a weapon on him. Was afraid of calling loudly for help. I was in a quiet corner of the ER and I felt like I would have had to yell to get attention, and I didn't want to startle him. I stayed there for a half hour and asked him more questions. Slipped out when he started to look sleepy. Not a psychologist, but I work at a psych hospital. Your first experience with a patient attempting to seriously injure or kill you is always frightening. But most of the time, at least at my workplace, it's more heartbreaking than scary. Not a psychologist. But saw a breakdown in my ex that scared me senseless. He had just started meds and the meds reacted horribly with him for whatever reason. He mostly had hallucinations. But sometimes had blackout and do activities and not remember them. He would call me screaming at 3 a.m. and he didn't remember a second of it. Any of it. He had hallucinations before. But they got increasingly dangerous with these meds. In particular, I think of one instance. While on the phone during an episode, he said, "I boiled some water." I asked why, as it was 3 a.m. And he replied eerily calmly, "They told me I have to stick my hand in here." It was absolutely terrifying. I finally begged him to go to the hospital that following morning to ask for a medication change, and he begrudgingly obliged. While he was there, he started throwing up blood and had to get his stomach pumped. Turns out, in one of his blackouts, he swallowed his entire bottle of medication. Not a psychiatrist or psychologist. RN on acute psych unit. I've had a few, but one that really stands out was a young and rather built fella. Perfect example of a sociopath. Charming when he wanted something. Zero capacity for empathy. Lack of remorse. Very manipulative. If you've seen the movie American Psycho, he nailed the role of Patrick Bateman. I won't give out too much information because I love my job and want to keep it. But anywho, just very cold. And I've never seen such an evil and malicious smile. Had that grin on his face seconds before assaulting a staff member. I'm not a psychologist, but I have 2 psych degrees and have been in and out of psychiatric wards since my late teens. For 14 years I worked with adults with developmental disabilities. So, as you can imagine, I've seen my fair share of frightening behavior. But nothing scared me more than nannying for a 5-year-old boy with autism and a mood disorder. He had just been released from the hospital where he had stayed for a month to get acclimated to behavioral meds. But in a short 2 weeks I nannied for him. I feared for my life. He would kick, bite, scratch, hit, spit, come after me with knives, punch cars, scream loud enough for neighbors to think he was being abused, and destroyed his mother's picture-perfect apartment. And when I tried to tell his mom that he needed more help than a babysitter could give him, she fired me saying I was wrong and that he just needs someone more attentive. Complete denial. Not an official psychologist, studying, but my cousin seriously worries me. He's becoming more and more manipulative and psychotic, and once threatened to shoot himself in the head if a classmate didn't give him back his game. My family can't do anything about it because my aunt and uncle are just as crazy. I feel bad for my other cousin because she's the only normal one there. A few people had unpredictable anger and outbursts that could be scary at times. And once a husband brought a gun to a couple's therapy session and threatened to kill himself/wife. Luckily we were able to calm the situation down. But things like that can end badly. And you always have to be aware of that possibility when emotions run high. Oh man, once I was psychotic, bipolar, in hospital, and imagined my parents and little brother were there, and I thought they came up an escalator into the hospital, not real, and my dad was about to be beaten up by these guys. I attacked a nurse trying to get to them, pushed her over, tried to pull out my catheter, and ran around looking to save my dad with nurses trying to hold me down. I feel absolutely horrid looking back because I really hurt that nurse, and by the time I came to and wanted to apologize, her shift had long ended and I never saw her again to say sorry. Therapist in training and my tutor, who is a childhood abuse and trauma specialist, tells some horror stories. The one that stood out for this question was a guy in his mid-40s who had lived most of his life with extreme paranoia that his parents were sending people to get information from him to blackmail him with. This guy was extremely unstable and was legally obligated to go to therapy after committing some petty theft because he believed his parents were tracking his money. Anyway, had been going for about 6 weeks and he began to talk about a plan for the future. He was kind of vague but said he had worked out a way to break free from his childhood and move forward. My tutor was apprehensive but hopeful. He had been making good progress in the previous sessions. Fast forward a week and this guy is back again. He's noticeably agitated and carrying a large sports bag. My tutor remarks that she's pleased to see him and likes his new bag. He breaks down. He confesses that he has a machete in the bag and had planned to kill everyone from his old life, starting with his therapist, so he could be free from his past, but she was very nice and would be hard to kill. My tutor politely excused herself and called the police. The guy was very compliant. Had pretty much given up at that point, but the police confirmed he did indeed have a large machete in his bag and his car was full of bin bags. She said that was the only time she felt she was close to dying, and says the moral of the story is to treat all your clients well because you never know who's plotting your murder. Not as psych, but I briefly worked at an inpatient psych hospital, and during my training a support code was called because a woman who'd had abdominal surgery had ripped open the wound and stitches and was saying over and over, "I can die now. I can die now," as she reached inside of her wound. I lasted only a month, but never felt fear like I did there. I'm not a psychologist yet, but a clinical behavior analyst in training. I work on a pediatric psych unit/school to get my clinical hours. My second day there, one of my patients lost it and started throwing cinnamon buns and shooting maple syrup at the staff. It took 6 cops and a taser to subdue her. Master's level psychotherapist here. Was doing anger management with a young person, 19/20 on probation for domestic assault. When we were talking about the situation and what happened, he said, "My girlfriend had a smart mouth, so I punched her in her mouth." I was talking to his probation agent later about his cold demeanor, and he told me to watch him closely. Suggested, verbatim, that he could be the next Ted Bundy. This was a PO that usually didn't get involved with a treatment program unless his probationers were really high risk. His words had me spooked. Kid violated probation quickly and was sentenced to a few more years, which we all thought was fine by us. He was creepy. I've worked with a variety of accused murderers, including one charged with, and very clearly guilty of, a triple premeditated homicide. Never really scared of them. Even though they were mentally ill, they were still fairly rational. Working with a short, brain-damaged female who assaulted me, security, and a psychiatrist regularly. Yes, I stopped working with her because she didn't just fight. She bit and spit. After an hour of lockdown, she would be calm and speak, only to escalate in minutes and assault another staff member. So have I been afraid? Yes. Of the one most people wouldn't think is actually dangerous. Not a psychologist, but I was held in a behavioral center for having attempted suicide when I was newly 13, and one of patients in with me had to wear a helmet because he would smash his head into the wall. When the nurses would come restrain him, he would scream that kind of scream that's so painful to hear it just makes you want to curl in a corner and cry. He also apparently had a history of sexual assault and was the reason none of the patients were allowed to sit with their legs open. He terrified me. I'm not a psychologist, but a CNA at a facility that treats a lot of dementia and Alzheimer's patients. We have had some with serious behaviors. One time this guy kicked me so hard in the left side of the rib cage that ribs on the right side were out of place. Not a psychologist, but my mom was. When I was younger. 13 ISH. She a client who was in his mid-50s. And a pedophile and child rapist. We lived in a general area of him. She was legally not allowed to file a claim against him or put him in a mental hospital for that. Partially the fact that he completely thought he was in the right, and part of the fact that my little sister was around his target age range scared the F**k out of her.